Waramuli, Anigani Yantan, Amawampa Yarraka Nango, Duncan Bunjalang Wanarua, Bintankan Birigaba Gangalu, Nkakal Yagara, Turrbal, Quandamuka, Jinabara, Yugurpal, and all sovereign nations. Or in English, hello everyone, my name is Yarraka Nango. Just done that acknowledgement in my mother's language, the Wanneroo people of New South Wales around the Hunter Valley area. Also acknowledging her Bunjalang mob, Northern New South Wales, my dad's people, the Birigaba and Gungaloo people of Central and Northern Queensland. But most importantly, we acknowledge all the nations where we are today, specifically the Southeast Queensland region, the Yarraka and Turrbal people, Brisbane, then we've got the Jinabara to the north, Quandamuka people on Stradbroke Island, and the Yugurpal people. Also Mananjali, we've got the Kumbameri, Yugambeh. We'd like to acknowledge all sovereign nations.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And we have a special guest on Walking Through Worlds, and today I'm really pleased to have our author and Brisbaneite now, who's written this book called The Last Gundir. Have I pronounced that right?
Gundir, yeah, Gundir.
Yeah, okay, and we're going to hear what that means and what that's all about. So we're going to introduce Nayef to give us a bit of background of, one, who he is and what his heritage and where his mob's from, how he ended up in Brisbane, and how he ended up writing a book which is focused around Brisbane. It's a historical fiction, and you can explain that. Let's sit back and hear the story.
Thank you, Greg, Yarraka. Excellent introduction there.
Thank you.
So my name is Nayef Din. I was born in Kuwait. I lived there for the first 10 years of my life. And then I moved to London. I grew up in London. I'm British. My parents are originally from Pakistan, but they're both British. Grew up in London and went to university, graduated as a civil engineer. And in 2008, I was asked to come down here to Brisbane to design 111 Eagle Street, one of the skyscrapers in the Brisbane CBD, and Airport Link, the tunnel nobody uses in Brisbane. So I moved across here 2008, 12 years ago, and I love history. I love to learn more about the place that I'm living in, and I just got more and more intrigued about Brisbane's history, both the colonial history, but then also the history that is almost invisible in bookshops, in libraries, in media, which is the local culture, the Aboriginal culture of this area before the Europeans turned up. So I think it's important for anyone living in a certain place to know the story of that place. So it doesn't matter where you live. You know, if you live in a certain place, you should know the story of that place. So I got intrigued to want to write more about Brisbane's Aboriginal history, but to write in a historic fiction way, so that it's a storyline, you get attached to characters. And then 3 years ago, I met Maruchi Baramba. She's been a fantastic guide. You know, she's.
Now, who is Maruchi?
Maruchi Baramba. She's the songwoman and the lawwoman of the Turrbal tribe, the Brisbane area, and she's been fantastic. She's been my guide for the last 3 years, and yeah, the kindness that she showed me, it was touching. It was really, really touching. So yeah, and then I released this novel, published this novel last year, self-published, but it's out there now. Avid Reader Bookshop, Riverbend Bookshop, and the SLQ Bookshop here.
So do you want to tell us a bit of the synopsis of what the story's about?
So the story, it's a bit Harry Potter-esque. You know, there's a young Turrbal boy. His name is Bunji. He attends the Bunya Nut Festival on Jarrawar country. That was arguably the largest Aboriginal gathering on the continent until 1902, the Bunya Nut Festival. So the story starts during that festival. You learn a bit about what the festival comprised, you know, what used to happen there, the trades, the marriage proposals, all those sorts of things. But then he gets sung to death by a Gundir. Now a Gundir it's a Dala word actually, meaning Aboriginal sorcerer. And there are two different types. There was one who healed and brought rain, the Jinding Gundir, and then there was one who actually killed people, who assassinated people, the Mingom Gundir. So Bunji, he becomes a victim of pointing the bone, and he survives. He ends up back in Turrbal country. The tribes, they're not sure how he survived, but then he goes to his Kipper trials, which is his manhood trials, and he starts to sort of see things that are going to arrive in the future, and also a little bit about his past. I don't want to say too much more without giving away about what happens to Bunji, but the novel does converge on real-life true events of 1823 that happened here in the Brisbane area.
So what I loved about finding this book and finding Nayef at the market selling these books is that it captures a period of Australian history between 1768 and 1823. And of course some of this history is, you know, historical fiction, but there's a lot in this that are the real letters from the articles from the British Museum and in Canberra. So there's an amazing amount of research that you've done to really awaken Australians about their own country and the history that intertwines between First Nations people. And that's what I love about it. Do you want to sort of talk about the period around this region, around Brisbane, or as we call Meanjin, what was occurring up until, I think you mentioned in the book, there's no white settlers really appearing here for quite a while. You know, what period was that?
So obviously the novel starts in 1768, and that's just basically when the Endeavour left England. So although this novel is looking at Aboriginal culture of Brisbane, it also explores the European efforts to find Terra Australis incognito, and the sequential visits by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the French, then the English. And in this area, James Cook had never actually come into Moreton Bay. He missed the entire bay itself. He went along the eastern coast of Moreton Island. He called that Moreton Bay. And he named that after Lord Moreton. And there's a letter that I've included in the novel, which is a fascinating letter from Lord Moreton, a British figure who in 1768, he encompassed the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement, if you want. And he was basically advocating for equality and saying you've got to treat Aboriginal people with respect and equally, and also remember that they are the lords of the country. So I put the actual letter word for word in the novel there as well. But in this whole region, the Endeavour missed Moreton Bay. Matthew Flinders, he was the first European to enter Moreton Bay itself. But he only had a few sort of skirmishing encounters on Yarun, Bribie Island, until 1823. And that's when the three ghosts, I don't want to reveal too much, I'd like the reader to come across that passage and go, oh, this is real, this actually happened. But that was 1823.
So how much of it is real and how much is storytelling?
Well, historic fiction, it's always going to be a blend. You have to blend education with imagination. So, for example, when I talk about the skin moieties for the Aboriginal people in this area, that's accurate.
Do you want to expand on that? What that is for the
that was a concept that I found really fascinating.
Me too.
The skin moiety concept. It's something that really blew my mind when I came across it. And the analogy that I give on my website, I have a blog on my website, and I give an analogy with the house system that you have in school. Now, in Kuwait, where I grew up, in the school that I went to, we all belong to a certain house. Like Harry Potter belongs to Gryffindor and Malfoy to Slytherin. So we all belong to a certain house. I was in Failaka, there was another house called Jahra, there was Bergen and Ahmadi. And Failaka was always the best house, so red ones there. But on sports day and swimming gala, you left your association with your class and you joined your new brothers and sisters in Failaka. And then you competed against the other lot. Skin moiety concept system, it's a system that is, I guess, a set of rules that govern an entire area. Everybody belongs to one skin type, and in this area there are 4. If you go further north, you find more. I think the Darwin area there's about 8 different types there, but here in the Brisbane area there were 4. There were 2 on one side, Banjur and Barang, 2 on the other, Chorin and Bonda. And if you belong to a certain skin type, everybody of that skin type was your brother or sister. So, and you inherited from your mum. So if your mum was a Banjur, then you became a Barang because they were twinned. And on the other side there was Bonda and Choroin. If your mum was a Bonda, then you became a Choroin. Now what that meant was that you could not marry a Choroin, could not marry another Choroin. They had to find someone on the other side and marry a Barang or a Banjur. To give you an example, imagine you're a Ugemba man, you're a Gold Coast man, and you want to visit Noosa. You leave Gold Coast, Ugemba, you come to the boundary with the Turrbal tribe. You light a fire, and I come over and say, what do you want? And you'll say, oh, I'm a Ugamba man of the emu totem, my skin moiety is Barang. I will then find someone from the Turrbal tribe who is a Barang, and this person has never seen you before. But I'll say, oh, your Barang brother's there, he's trying to get to Noosa. But he is now under tribal obligation to escort you on Turrbal country, to keep you warm, to feed you, to keep, to tell you stories about his life that he may not tell me, even though we're both Turrbal people. He will see you as his brother. He will get up to the boundary with the Gubbi Gubbi peoples, Sunshine Coast, light a fire, someone will come over, what do you want? It's, oh, my Barang brother here is trying to get to Noosa. So they'll find maybe a woman this time, a Barang woman of the Gubbi Gubbi peoples. This person will see you again as her brother. You will see her as your sister. And she will help you get to Noosa, which meant that wherever you went in this area, you were never an only child. You were always had brothers and sisters, always ready to offer you assistance and protection wherever you were, which I thought was fascinating. The fact that
so beautiful.
Because in reality, what that means is that any stranger that approaches, you treat them with kindness,
Exactly.
because you don't know if that person is related to you or someone within the tribe. And in some ways, I think that worked against the local tribes once the colony first arrived. And I'm exploring that in the sequel to the novel, exploring the themes of why the colony survived here when there were 10 spears for every musket. How is it that the colony survived? And I think the kindness, particularly around the skin moiety concept system, where they saw the invaders as potentially Turrbal ghosts, Turrbal people who have died, have come back, and therefore they are related to somebody in the tribe. You wouldn't shoot somebody who you thought was your relation. So it did work against Aboriginal people, I think. But again, that's a concept that I think people should be aware of today, because it's fascinating.
But I think the mob concept, which still I've encountered, in urban settings where people are really close to each other through family lines, aren't they? If they share similar or because a lot of the Western names they've picked up, the Johnsons or the Greens or whatever, have come from the history, I understand, is the farmers.
Yep.
They took the name from the farmers, which is a similar thing that happened in America with African American slaves at the time, wasn't it? Didn't they take property owners' surnames and that became their name? It was never their real name, but that was the Western name that they were given and that they hung on to. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm only going on what I'd heard.
Yeah, it sounds similar. Yeah, what I love about just you explaining that, and especially focusing on the strengths of Aboriginal culture, is that unbroken line of kinship. There's so many different layers, and I love that, because in our languages there's no word for auntie or uncle or cousin. You have obligations as a parent, grandparent or sibling, and we only have language names for those. So that just reaffirms everything we've been taught. And when we travel to other communities, that there's always someone there ready to offer you a bed or a cuppa or a feed. Wherever we go in Aboriginal communities, we know that we're going to be warmly welcomed, because we'll know someone that knows someone, or is connected to a family member. And I think that's so beautiful. And what I also love is that it's hearing a lot of the local history from a foreigner, when a lot of people born and raised in this country have limited knowledge on the true history of this country. So it's a breath of fresh air to hear the local knowledge and the amazing history, and you share it with such passion. And I absolutely love that. We need more people like you. So thank you for this book. I can't wait to read it. I know you've read it, and I'm just wondering what would be a little spiel, like a review on this book.
Oh, for anyone to read it, look, it's one of those books that if you've never read historical fiction, it feels so real, and the characters come to life, and you really engage with the characters. You get a sense of their feelings, their emotions, what's going on. And as Nayef has sort of has said, he's incorporated a lot of the true history, letters that we don't even know about, that we've never heard going to school. We've never heard these true histories. We talk about truth. There's a lot of truth embodied in this book. So it really is for people to wake them up, to think about that relationship, regardless of where we've all come from, to really have that deep respect for our First Nations people and what they've gone through. Now what is that word that we were talking about, and explain that, because this word.
Palimpsest.
Palimpsest. That's our word for the day.
Yes.
Palimpsest.
So Raymond Evans, he's a very well-known historian, local historian in Brisbane. He's published many books. In reviewing my book, he wrote The Past is a Palimpsest. And basically, a palimpsest is when you get layers, particularly in geology, when you have layers of rock, and each layer tells its story of the time that existed at that time. And so this novel, what this does is it strips away the current development of Brisbane, the Brisbane region, strips that away. It then strips away the early colonial history as well, and then looks at what did this area look like in those days. So the Kipper Ring at Samford, Queensland was called back then, place of possums. But that's a Kipper Ring. So what used to happen there? You know, nowadays you drive past Upper White's Mountain Road, you'll see the bull ring there. It doesn't look like much but a clearing. But strip away the current development and that area was alive with such important traditions of this area. And that particular bull ring itself was very important compared to other bull rings.
Well, I learned something particularly in there when you talk about Kipper Ring, because last year we moved down to Redcliffe, and Redcliffe has a suburb called Kipper Ring. And even though we're in a new settlement called Newport, the GPS says we're in Kipper Ring. And right from our backyard, we're on a wetland. So probably prior to this development, where we're living was a wetland, and it was Kipper Ring. It was probably sacred ground used for ceremony, and it was a rites of passage, wasn't it, for young boys to men. When you were doing that, that writing about Kipper Ring and the rites of passage, how were you feeling in terms of comfort? Because I know a lot of this is sacred in terms of what can be written about and what can be spoken. How did you navigate that
good question.
To actually get it right without sort of giving too much away? And how did you go?
Yeah, that's an important question, and particularly around a lot of the local culture. Initially, when I started to write this novel, it was very difficult to actually do the research for Aboriginal culture, because you can go to the library, you can pick up a book on Aboriginal culture, but the problem is that the information there might be relevant to some tribe in Darwin, not
South Australia or
South Australia. It wouldn't be specific to this particular area. What really, if you want to call it divine intervention or whatever, I was at the Bookfest many years ago, almost 8 years ago, and I came across this small tattered second edition copy of Reminiscences of Early Queensland. Now, it's a book that was written by Tom Petrie. So Tom Petrie, he was a young boy. Andrew Petrie was a civil engineer. They asked him to come up here to fix up the colony because the colony was struggling. The windmill that you see in Roma Street, that was not working. It was an engineering disaster. So Andrew Petrie was asked to come up here and help build the colony. Now, Tom Petrie was a very young boy. He was a 6-year-old boy. And, boys are like, they're curious, they're not biased. They're too young to have that sort of bias in them. So he grew up here with the Aboriginal community, with the Aboriginal tribes. He learned their language, he earned their trust. They invited him to the Bunya Festival. The reason that I can write about the Bunya Festival with some accuracy is because he described what he saw. And he also describes the kippa making ceremony. They invited him to the ceremony at Samford, at Kipper. So first-hand, I don't want to use the word tainted. It was pure Aboriginal culture that no missionaries could come and later corrupt. It was pure culture. He was a young boy growing up here. There were Aboriginals all over this colony area. I know we call it Boundary Street, and there was a boundary fence, but before that happened, he was growing up immersed in their culture. So in that book that I found in Bookfest, it described all of the cultural tradition that he had seen firsthand.
Wow.
And I thought this information should be out there.
Yes.
And so I used that as like a blueprint to weave my stories, my characters, so when they go through the kippa making ceremony, I've tried to keep that very accurate, very respectful to what was actually described in those. It was
almost like a little Olympic Games. Within there were a series of games that the boys played.
Before the actual initiation started, they could do that. But when the initiation started, they had to stop. It was weeks and weeks of self-discipline of periods where they couldn't look up to the sky, periods where they couldn't eat certain foods. Basically self-restraint and trials. You know, we talk about, I don't know, like conscription, for example, teaches young men and women, you know, discipline and habits for the future. It was a bit like that, you know, where you go through training to become a young man, and also you learn about secret corroborees that only you are allowed to see, and that's why there were certain rankings of Boer rings around Australia, around this region. So yeah, and it was basically a rite of passage. So once you finish, then you could even have a new name. You know, you wouldn't keep your original name. But I try to keep all the characters having the same name. Otherwise, it would just confuse people. If the same character changed name 3 times, like what?
Now there is a bit in this book that I want one of us to read, and it was towards the end, and I'm going to maybe throw it open to Yarraka if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
I want you to read it. She hasn't read this, but I'd like you to listen to what she's about to read, and then we're going to have a little discussion around it. 427 is the page.
So, general comment. An empire seeking to expand encounters a vast island on the edge of the known world. The island comprises a number of tribes, each living in their own country and following a simple rural life. The natives speak a group of similar languages, but their traditions and beliefs vary across the land. There exist clever men who the locals believe could perform magic. The empire believes that capturing this last land on the edge of the known world is strategically important and sends its fleet across the sea. Its superior weaponry is sufficient to overcome resistance, and the land is successfully claimed by the empire. Shortly afterwards, colonies are established with the building of towns and roads across the land. Governors are installed locally to represent the empire. Sacred sites are mostly destroyed in the process. Some natives are pushed into the northern and western areas of the land. Others rally and try to resist, but are massacred in battles. Some try or are forced to assimilate into the culture of the invaders. The different tribes all have to learn the one language of the empire, and eventually their own languages begin to die out. The reader is forgiven for assuming the above paragraph is describing the invasion and colonisation of Australia by the British Empire. It is in fact describing the invasion and colonisation of Britain by the Roman Empire. Prior to Roman invasion in the 1st century, Britain comprised a number of tribes living in their own countries. These tribes included I'm not going to pronounce these right, so I'll hand over to you.
So Catavaloni, around Hertfordshire, Damoni, Cornwall, Ordovices, one of many in Wales, Brigantes, Yorkshire, Canty, Kent, and Veniconis, one of many in Scotland.
Wow. So like the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, these tribes had their own identities but could converse with neighbouring tribes as they spoke a group of similar Celtic languages. There was little sense of belonging to one nation. Just as the Europeans provided the names of New Holland and later Australia to a collective group of different nations, the Romans provided the names of Britannia, England, Caledonia, which is Scotland, and Hibernia, which is Ireland, to the collective group of different nations. The Romans believed that these islands lay tantalizingly close to the edge of the known world, drawing a parallel with European efforts to find Terra Australis Incognito.
There you go.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is. When I read that, after reading a lot of history, and I realised, you know, we're talking here about the Celtic people of the western sort of areas within probably, you know, UK, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and knowing that that goes further up, goes up into Spain, and it goes all the way up through France in Brittany and Quiberon, you know, because you'll find a lot of stone structures. They had these, you know, very much this influence around what we know as Stonehenge, but there's a lot of stone sacred sites all through that western thing. So here they were 2,000 years ago, the Brittanies were basically decimated by the Romans. And it's almost like, to me, what came was, you know, a karmic response or something that has occurred in our histories, you know, and this is not alone, that we've got to look at that, learn from that, and then say, well, here we are in this environment. We've had 200 years of this, you know, a little over 200 years, but now, as we know, it's about this healing and unification, really deeply understanding what's occurred, and we can't just brush it away. You know, we can't just go, oh yeah, that's 230 years ago. This is, you know, civilizations like the Celtics that existed, had a very peaceful existence, looking after the land, were really nature-based people, and this has occurred, you know, in so many levels, again, in that sort of layers and layers across our humanity for thousands of years. And here we are, probably one of the last continents that really had this done to it, and the first peoples. You know, Northern America obviously had it, Canada had it, South Africa, you know, Africa's had it with the invasion and colonization. But it's just interesting that's why this book is so good, because it makes you really think about that beautiful history that was here way before, and to realize that they really had a kindness and that they were kind to each other once they knew their role within their society and their civilization, you know. It's can only have so much deeper respect.
Definitely.
It's a portrayal of life that happened here without any, I guess, without the influences of colonization. And I think the first step to reconciliation isn't to say sorry. The first step is to learn and understand. So that's what the book tried to do. Essentially, it tries to sort of portray what life was like here before we turned up. And it's historic fiction, so there are some things which in the commentary of the novel I call out that this is fictional and that this is real. But it still allows you a flavor for understanding and at least appreciating that this was a civilization that was highly evolved, it was highly spiritual. James Cook himself, when he came here, he'd seen the tribes in Tahiti, he'd seen the tribes in New Zealand, the Maoris, and he'd seen the Aboriginal people, and he said that unlike the other two, here they didn't prize gems and beads and cloths. You give them these beads and then the next day they're scattered by the fire.
And like the Mongolian tribes of the prairies, that the Chinese were trying to offer silver or gold. And the Mongolian tribes, Genghis Khan and all that, didn't see these material things as any serving no purpose. So they couldn't really trade.
So and along the coast of Queensland, you know, he stopped 13 times and interacted with quite a few tribes, and he noted down that although they appear wretched in condition, Aboriginal people are in reality far happier than we Europeans. His words, because he'd seen that unlike the Tahitians and the Maoris, the Aboriginal people were different. They were very different in culture, very different in how they treated each other, and how they treated strangers as well. So that's it's got a bit of that as well. It's got a bit of the European exploration.
I think that's wonderful. And where does someone pick up a copy of this book?
So Avid Reader Bookshop in West End, Riverbend Bookshop in Bulimba, the SLQ Bookshop here as well, Berkelo in New Mundy. At the moment, most of those have sold out, so I'm doing a second print run soon, but
Excellent.
Hopefully I'll get them.
Now, what about people outside that are hearing this from?
So Amazon, you can order on Amazon as well, and Kobo. There's another book depository sort of place.
And this is not just the only book. You mentioned you've got a sequel coming?
Yes, there's a sequel to this,
fantastic,
which carries on the story into the period where the first colony arrives to Queensland. So there's more of the frontier conflict themes in that novel, as opposed to this one. This one is mostly European exploration and pure Aboriginal culture. The second one is more of the interactions, the frontier conflict, the sort of novels that you tend to find in the bookshops. Quite often you wouldn't find a book like this, which doesn't focus on the negative aspects, just rejoices in local Aboriginal culture.
I love that. We definitely need more books like that. And I wanted to something stuck in my mind that you said earlier. You know, you come to this country and you wanted to learn, the local history, and I think that's something that a lot of people miss, whether they're born and raised here or visitors to this country, because it should be common knowledge. You know, the true history of this country should be common knowledge because it's our shared history, whether you're a citizen or resident of this country. And you said that, you know, when we learn about the place we live in, I think that's just a given for us, we do that. But my grandmother always used to say, if you live in this place and you call this place home, you have an obligation to learn the true history.
Yeah.
And that's for, you know, whoever you are, wherever you're living. And when you learn the true history of a place, you have a much deeper respect and appreciation, and a connection. You know, you have a pride, a sense of pride in the place that you call home. And I think if we all adopted that methodology, you know, just learning about the place we live in, whether it's any of the 150 or so suburbs that we live in Brisbane, there's like 50 of those suburbs still with the original or derivative of the original place name. So I think, you know, there's going to be a lot to be learnt from this book. I'm a history buff, so I'm really looking forward to learning more about the local history. And, you know, my 3 children and my 2 granddaughters were born here in Meanjin, so it's important that I instill this same sense of connection to their birthplace, and to respect and remind us that we're visitors on someone else's land. So I'm definitely going to be reading this and passing it on to my children, so thank you.
And I really appreciate you coming today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks for
Thank you,
joining
Thank
us.
you very much. Lovely
Thank
to
you.
talk with you.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our website and our YouTube channel, which is walkin3worlds.com. Come to our website and stay in touch and have a listen to many great episodes we release every week. And thanks, Nayef. I'm really, really excited to have you on today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks.